The candles at Ashcombe House had been lit for 3 hours, when Eleanor Brant understood that the gloves were no longer enough. She stood at the edge of the long gallery, where the music carried thin across the marble, and she kept her hands folded low against the front of her gray silk, the way a woman folds her hands when she does not wish them looked at. The kid leather reached past her wrists. It had cost her the last of the housekeeping money, and she had bought it for one reason only, which was to cover the band of plain gold that no widow of 6 months ought still to be wearing in a room such as this. The room had decided already what she was. A poor relation in last season's silk, brought along to fill a chair and be grateful. She heard it in the way the footman did not quite meet her eye, and in the small adjustment of skirts when she passed, and she had learned to hear it without flinching. At the head of the gallery stood a man who did not move. Where the others drifted and turned and laughed behind their fans, he held still, a tall figure in a dark coat near the terrace doors, watching the room the way a man watches weather he does not trust. This was Marcus Hale, the Earl of Wexford, and the season had a great deal to say about him. That he had not danced in 2 years, that he had buried something he would not name, that his face had set like cold iron and stayed there. Eleanor knew none of it firsthand. She knew only that when the crowd parted for a moment, his gaze had crossed the room, and stopped briefly on her folded hands, then lifted to her face, and held there a beat longer than a stranger's gaze had any right to. She looked away first. She always looked away first. If you have ever stood at the edge of a room that has already decided you are not worth crossing it for, stay with this story a while. You may find it ends somewhere you did not expect. She had not wanted to come. Her cousin Adelaide had insisted, in the particular tone Adelaide used when insistence was really instruction, that a season in mourning was a waste, that grey was perfectly acceptable now that the worst of it was past, and that Eleanor could hardly expect the family to keep her in idleness forever. The word forever had sat in the carriage between them the whole way to Ashcombe. Adelaide had filled the rest of the journey with a list, delivered as kindness, of all the things Eleanor must now learn to want: a settled situation, a roof not borrowed, a second husband of sufficient means and sufficient blindness to a widow's history. "You are 25, Adelaide had said, smoothing her own far finer skirts, "and not without looks, when you trouble to make something of yourself. There is time yet, if you do not waste it, grieving a man who left you nothing." Eleanor had said nothing. She had pressed her gloved fingers together in her lap, and watched the dark hedgerows go by, and thought of the small house in Dorset that had been hers and Thomas's for 11 months, and was no longer anyone's, the lease surrendered, the furniture sold to settle what he had left owing. She had not known, when she married him, that a man could die and leave behind only debts and a name that opened no doors. She had learned it the way one learns most hard things, in a solicitor's office, sitting very straight, being told. The solicitor had been kind in the way of men who must deliver bad news for a living, which was to say he had been brisk. There was the matter of the outstanding sums. There was the matter of the lease. There was the matter, he had said, gentling his voice for the first time, of what a young widow in her position might reasonably hope for, which he advised her to consider sooner rather than later. She had walked out into the Dorset rain afterward, and stood in it until her bonnet was ruined, because the ruin of the bonnet was a thing she could at least feel. The wound she carried was not grief alone. Grief she could have borne. The wound was the thing the solicitor's office had taught her about her own worth, which was that she was now a problem to be solved, a sum to be subtracted, a woman whose only remaining value was how quietly she could be married off again or kept out of sight. She had loved Thomas, and Thomas had loved her, and none of that had survived him in any form the world could weigh. The ring was all that was left. It was thin, and it was plain, and it had cost him more than he could afford, and she could not make herself take it off. And so she covered it, because a widow still wearing her wedding band into a marriage market was a kind of confession no one would forgive. The gloves were the lie she told the room. The ring was the truth she told herself. Across the gallery, the Dowager Countess of Wexford held court from a gilt chair, her fan moving at a measured height, her rings catching the candlelight each time her hand turned. She was the Earl's grandmother, and she had outlived 3 of the people she had loved best, and had decided, somewhere along the way, that love was a luxury the family could no longer afford to indulge. Beside her sat Miss Cassandra Finch, the diamond of the season arranged in ice blue silk, with the ease of a girl who had never once been told she did not belong. The dowager's plan was no secret. Cassandra was to be the next Countess of Wexford, and the matter wanted only the Earl's cooperation, which the dowager intended to secure before the spring was out. Eleanor came within the dowager's view by accident, drifting too near the gilt chair in her search for a quiet corner, and the old woman's gaze went over her once, top to hem, and dismissed her in a single sentence pitched just loud enough to carry. "The Brant girl," she said to Cassandra, not lowering her voice at all. "A widow with nothing but debts. One does wonder why Adelaide brings her." The fans nearest the chair stilled for half a breath. A young woman in primrose looked at Eleanor, and then looked quickly away, and the look was worse than the sentence. Eleanor felt the heat climb her throat and into her face, and she felt her gloved right hand close hard over her left, over the ring beneath the leather, and she made herself breathe and made herself smile, the small smile that gave nothing back. She said, "I am sure I do not know, your ladyship," in a voice that did not shake, and she moved on before the shaking could begin. She did not see the Earl turn his head. He did, all the same. The supper room at Ashcombe had been laid for 40, and Eleanor found herself seated near the bottom of the table, between a deaf colonel and an empty chair, which suited her exactly. She ate little. She listened to the talk move up and down the cloth like weather, and she kept her gloves on through the soup, which a sharper-eyed neighbor might have remarked upon, and which the colonel did not notice at all. It was here, in the small theater of the lower table, that the second test of the evening came to her. And it came in the shape of a child. The Earl's ward was a girl of perhaps 7, named Beatrice, brought down to make her curtsy to the company, be admired and removed. She was admired badly. A man 2 seats up, flushed with wine, caught the child by the wrist as she passed, and made some joke about her plain face and her dead parents that the table found amusing, and the child went white and still in the way children do when they have learned that crying makes a thing worse. The laughter ran along the cloth, easy and careless. The laughter of people who had never once been the smallest person at a table. Somewhere up the board a woman murmured that the poor relation in grey had risen. How singular. And the murmur carried the same weight the dowager's verdict had carried. The room's settled opinion that a widow with nothing had no standing to do anything at all. No one rose. The dowager at the far end did not so much as turn. And Eleanor, who had spent 11 months learning exactly what it cost to be the smallest and least defended person in a room, put down her spoon, rose from her place, and crossed to the child. She did not raise her voice. She knelt, which a lady in silk does not do at a supper table, and she took the little girl's freed wrist gently in her gloved hands and said, loud enough for only the child to hear, that the gentleman was tired and did not know what he was saying, and that Beatrice had made a very fine curtsy, the finest of the evening. And would she care to show it once more? To someone who would watch it properly. And the child, after a moment, nodded and made her curtsy again, gravely, to Eleanor alone. And Eleanor returned it as though they two were the only people in the room. The flushed man subsided, abruptly aware that the thing he had done looked smaller now than it had a moment before, and the table found other matters. What she did not know was that at the head of the table, the Earl of Wexford had risen halfway from his chair and then sat slowly back down, because by the time he was on his feet, the thing was already mended, and the woman who had mended it had done so without once looking to see whether anyone watched. He watched. He watched her return to her place at the bottom of the table and pick up her spoon as though nothing had happened, and he watched her keep her gloves on, and something in his still face moved, and was disciplined back into stillness. Eleanor did not sleep well that night, and not for the reasons the dowager would have supposed. She lay in the narrow guest bed Adelaide had assigned her, the gloves at last drawn off, the ring turned round and round on her finger in the dark, and she thought of the child's white face and her own dead husband, and the particular loneliness of being the only person in a room willing to stand. She did not think of the Earl. She had trained herself not to think of men who stood at the heads of tables. That way lay a second kind of ruin, and she had survived the first, only barely. The following morning brought rain, and with the rain came an invitation that made no sense. The Earl of Wexford requested, through his steward, that Mrs. Brant attend his ward in the matter of the child's reading. The girl having taken a sudden and unaccountable fancy to the lady in grey, it was framed as employment. It was, Adelaide observed sourly over the breakfast chocolate, a great condescension, and Eleanor would of course accept, since beggars did not refuse earls. Eleanor accepted. She told herself it was the wage. She did not entirely believe herself. The library at Wexford Court was the largest room Eleanor had ever stood inside. 2 stories of leather and gilt rising to a painted ceiling. The tall windows running with rain, and the Earl was in it when she arrived, which the steward had not warned her of. He stood at the far end with his back to her, one hand resting flat on a closed book on the table, the other at his side, and he did not turn at once when the footman announced her. When he did turn, his face was the cold iron the season had promised, and his first words to her were not a greeting, but a command. "Come closer," he said. "I do not intend to shout the length of the room." She came closer. Her heart was doing something foolish that she chose to attribute to the size of the room. He looked at her for a long moment, at her grey silk and her plain bonnet, and the gloves she had not removed, though the fire was high, and then he said, in the same level voice, "You will sit. You have been standing since you came in, and you will be of no use to the child." Exhausted. It was an order. It sounded like coldness. Underneath it, where she could not yet hear it, was something that had noticed she was tired, and had decided to do something about it. She sat. There was a wing chair near the fire, and she took the edge of it. Her spine straight, her gloved hands in her lap, the posture of a woman accustomed to being interviewed rather than received. He did not sit. He moved to the window and stood with the rain at his back, and for a time he did not speak at all, and the silence in the great room was not unkind, only enormous. "The child does not take to people," he said at last. "She has had 3 governesses since the spring. She frightened off 2, and the 3rd left of her own accord." He turned the closed book a quarter turn on the table beneath his hand, as though it required adjusting. "She has asked for you by name. I should like to understand why, before I trust her to a stranger." "I could not tell you why, your lordship," Eleanor said. "I knelt to her at the supper table and returned her curtsy." It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. He said it flatly, as a man states a sum. No one else rose. She had no answer to that, and so she gave none. They spoke, instead of the practical matter, of hours and books and wages, and he named a wage so far above what the work was worth that she nearly refused it, and then thought of the surrendered lease, and did not. Through all of it he watched her hands, and once when she lifted her gloved fingers to turn a page he had set before her, his gaze followed the motion and his jaw tightened, and he said nothing. He did not ask about the gloves. A lesser man would have asked. He filed it away instead, the way he filed everything, behind a face that gave nothing. When she rose to go, he crossed and opened the library door himself, which a footman ought to have done, and as she passed him, she was aware of exactly how near he stood, and exactly how still, and her pulse answered him before her sense could intervene, and she carried that small betrayal out into the rain with her, like a coal she did not know how to put down. The weeks that followed taught Eleanor that there were 2 earls. There was the one the world saw, who did not dance and did not laugh, and whose displeasure cleared a room. And there was the other one whom only she and the child seemed to meet, who carried the girl's discarded shawl back to her without comment, who appeared in the library doorway at the hour the lessons ended as though by accident, and stood watching his ward read with an expression Eleanor had no name for, who said, "Eat something." When the long afternoons ran past the dinner hour, and how to trace scent without waiting for her answer. The commands never softened. The substance underneath them did. There was the afternoon the child fell ill with a low fever, and the household assumed the governess would withdraw, and Eleanor did not, but sat the night through at the small bed with a basin and a cloth. And near dawn the Earl came in his shirt sleeves, with a candle, and found her there. He did not thank her. He stood in the doorway a long moment and then crossed and put his own coat about her shoulders, because the nursery fire had burned low and she had not thought to mind it, and he said only, "You will not make yourself ill on her account. Go and sleep an hour. I will sit." And he sat, the great Earl of Wexford, in a nursemaid's chair beside a child's bed, with the awkward tenderness of a man performing a thing he had forbidden himself for years, and Eleanor went and slept the hour because she had learned that arguing with the substance underneath his commands was a waste of breath they both needed. There was the morning he found her in the cold corridor in only her spencer and asked her, in a tone that brooked no answer, why she had no warmer thing, and the next day a wool shawl appeared, folded on the library table with no note and no explanation. And when she tried to return it, he looked at her as though she had said something in a language he did not speak, and she kept it. She found to her alarm that she had begun to listen for his step in the corridor. She found, to greater alarm, that her body knew where he was in a room before her mind permitted her to look. It was a thing she could not govern. He would enter behind her while she read with the child, silent, and her skin would know it, the back of her neck would know it, her breath would alter half a measure before she had any cause to turn, and she would have to school herself not to. She told herself it was a servant's wariness of a master. She knew it was not. The body does not lie about such things, however well the mouth is trained. It was near the middle of that strange employment that she learned what had made him. The child told her in the artless way of children that the lady in the picture had been Beatrice's aunt, the Earl's sister, and that she had died of a fever in the cold months while the Earl was away in town, on business he could have left undone, and that he had not been there, and that the picture had hung in the library until the Earl had it turned to the wall. Eleanor looked, and there it was, a framed portrait set with its face to the paneling, and she understood. His coldness was not the absence of feeling. It was the scar tissue over a wound he had decided he deserved. He had been absent once when it mattered, and a person he loved had died of it, and he had resolved never again to be absent, and never again to love anything he might fail. The child was his penance, the stillness was his discipline. He had built a life out of standing guard so that he would never again arrive too late. She did not let on that she knew. Yet one evening, when the lessons had run long and the child had gone up and the fire had burned to a red bed of coals, she found him standing before the turned portrait, with one hand resting on its frame, not turning it, only resting there. And she ought to have withdrawn and did not. She came and stood near him, near enough that the warmth of the dying fire reached them both, and she said very quietly that her own husband had died, while she sat in the next room believing he slept, and that she had spent a great while afterward, arranging the blame so that it landed upon herself, and that it had taken her a long time to understand that grief looks for a place to stand, and that the self is the nearest ledge. He did not look at her. His hand stayed on the frame. After a long silence he said, "And did you find a better ledge for it?" And she said that she had not quite, but that she had stopped throwing herself off the one she had. The smallest sound came from him then. Not a laugh. The near relation of one. The first she had heard. He turned his head and looked at her, and the look went on past the moment a look between strangers may decently last, and she felt the heat climb into her face and did not look away. Not this time. And the space between his hand on the frame and her hand at her side was perhaps a foot of warm air that neither of them crossed. Neither crossed it. That was the whole of it, and it was a great deal. Eleanor told no one she had understood. She stopped flinching at his commands instead, because she had learned to hear what was inside them. She did not yet permit herself to hope. You might, watching from where you sit, already see what she could not hold the thought a little longer, because the season was not finished with her. The dowager noticed the lessons. The dowager noticed everything that threatened the order she had spent her life defending. And a widow with nothing teaching the heir's ward and drawing the heir's eye was a threat she met with the full machinery of her position. She came to the library one afternoon on a pretext, found Eleanor and the child and the Earl in a tableau of perfectly innocent domesticity, the three of them bent over a book of engravings, while the rain ran down the tall windows, and she stood in the doorway long enough to be sure she had seen what she had come to see. The child's hand on Eleanor's sleeve, the Earl seated, when the Earl never sat in company. The ease of it. The dowager's eyes took the inventory of a woman who had spent 60 years reading rooms for exactly this kind of trouble. She crossed and seated herself with the deliberateness of a verdict taking its chair, and she said to her grandson, in front of the governess as though the governess were furniture, "You will recall that Miss Finch dines with us Thursday. It would not do for the household to acquire habits that Miss Finch might find peculiar." Then she turned to Eleanor and added, with the smile that did not reach her eyes, "The girl is fond of you, I am told. How fortunate for a woman in your circumstances to be found useful. One must take one's value where one can when one has so little of one's own." She let the sentence sit. She wished it to be understood. A governess was a convenience, and conveniences were dismissed when the household's true business resumed, and the dowager intended Eleanor to know the date of her own dismissal before it came. There it was again, the widow with nothing, useful at best, valued only as long as she was needed, and not a moment beyond. Eleanor curtsied and said nothing, and her gloved hand closed over the ring. The Earl, by the window, went very still. He did not contradict his grandmother. He never had. The dowager rose, satisfied, and went out, and the child looked between the two adults with the wariness of someone who has felt a cold draught and cannot find the open door. And Eleanor gathered her gently back to the book, and read on in a voice that did not shake, because not shaking was the one accomplishment her season had perfected. The Thursday dinner was the trap, though Eleanor did not know it, until she was inside it. She had not been invited to dine. She had been summoned afterward on the pretext that the child wished to say good night, and she came into the drawing-room in her gray silk and found the whole company assembled, Cassandra radiant at the dowager's side, the table cleared, the stage set. The dowager had arranged it with care. She wished the Earl to declare for Miss Finch before witnesses, and she wished the governess present to see her own place made plain, and she had chosen the moment with a general's eye. "Ah, Mrs. Brand," the dowager said, as Eleanor entered. "How well you keep yourself, for a woman with so little to keep. Come, you may as well hear it with the rest. We are settling my grandson's future tonight." She turned to the room, and announced in the voice of someone reading a verdict that an understanding had been reached, that the Earl of Wexford and Miss Cassandra Finch were to be married in the summer, and that the family was most gratified. She had not consulted her grandson. She had calculated that he would not contradict her before company, because he never had, because his discipline was a kind of obedience, and she had built her whole strategy upon it. Eleanor felt the floor go strange beneath her. She had been so careful. She had told herself nothing, permitted herself nothing, and still the announcement landed in her like a blow she had not braced for, and she understood in that moment exactly how much she had come to feel, and exactly how foolish it had been. She looked at the Earl. His face was iron. He said nothing. And the not saying was the cruelest thing of all, because she read it through her wound, the way she read everything. Her wound told her that of course he said nothing. Of course. She had imagined it. Of course a man at the head of a table did not choose a woman with debts and a dead husband and a secret ring under her glove. The shawl that had appeared without a note, the coat about her shoulders in the cold nursery, the near laugh before the turned portrait. She gathered all of it up in an instant and reread it, as the kindness any decent master shows a useful servant, and the rereading was a small private execution, performed standing in a room full of people who would have been pleased to watch. She did the only thing left to her, which was to leave with her dignity. She crossed to the child who had begun to cry, and she knelt again as she had at the supper table, and she told Beatrice that she must be a good girl and mind her new aunt, and her voice held. Just then she rose to go. The dowager could not let her go quietly. Triumph wanted a witness to its completion. "Before you leave us," she said, "perhaps you would do the company the courtesy of removing your gloves. We have all of us wondered at a woman who dines in them and reads in them and curtsies in them. Surely among friends you need not hide your hands." It was meant as the final humiliation, a small cruelty to seal a large one, the exposure of whatever shabby secret the poor relation kept beneath the leather. The room went quiet. Eleanor stood at the center of it, and she felt every eye, and she made her decision, the way she made all her hardest decisions, which was to choose the truth over the lie, even when the truth would cost her more. She drew off her right glove and then her left, slowly, and she held her bare hands open before the company, and on the third finger of the left, plain and thin and unmistakable, was the wedding band of a husband 6 months in the ground. "I wear it," she said into the silence, her voice low and entirely steady, "because I loved him, and because no circumstance of mine obliges me to pretend I did not." She looked at the dowager without anger. "You may call that useless if you wish. I find I do not care to call it anything but mine. It should have been the end of her. A widow flaunting her grief in a marriage market, contradicting a countess in her own drawing room, was finished, and Eleanor knew it, and she had said it anyway. And she turned to leave the room she had ruined herself in. She had taken 3 steps when the Earl of Wexford crossed the room. He crossed it in front of all of them, in front of his grandmother and Miss Finch and the assembled witnesses of the season, and he did not hurry, and the not hurrying made it worse for the dowager and better for everyone, with eyes to see. He stopped before Eleanor and he reached out, and he took her bare left hand in both of his, the ring between his palms. And he looked at it, and then he looked at her, and the iron was gone from his face entirely. What was underneath it had been there for weeks. Only now did he let the room see it. "I will not marry Miss Finch," he said. The words were level, and they were final, and they carried to every corner of the silent room. The dowager came half out of her chair. "Marcus, you forget yourself. You forget what is owed." "I forget nothing," he said, still holding Eleanor's hand. "I have spent 2 years forgetting nothing. I was not present once when I was needed, and I have not forgiven it, and I will not arrange my life now around the avoidance of feeling, because I have watched this woman feel everything in a room that gave her no reason to, and I find I would rather be like her than like us." He turned to Eleanor then, and his voice dropped, and the next words were for her, though the room heard them. He said her given name, which he had never used. Eleanor. It was the whole declaration, that one name. The crowd heard it land. Then he said the thing that ended it. The short and irrevocable thing. The claim that could not be unmade once it was made in front of witnesses. "I mean to marry her with the ring she already wears." The silence held for one long beat, and then the room began, very quietly, to rearrange itself around the new truth. A dowager's plan does not collapse with a crash. It collapses with a small sound. A fan lowered to a lap. A sentence begun and not finished. The dowager sat back in her gilt chair, and her hand, which had been so sure all evening, went still, and for a moment her face showed not anger but something older and more tired. The recognition of a woman who has just understood that the order she defended has moved on without consulting her. Cassandra, to her credit, was the first to recover, and she rose, and she crossed to Eleanor, and she said with a composure that did her more honor than the diamonds that she wished them very happy, and that she had never much cared for summer weddings in any case. The crowd took its cue from her. By such small motions are verdicts overturned. Near the door, the child Beatrice had stopped crying. She stood watching the two of them with her hand pressed to her mouth, and when Eleanor looked at her, she ran the length of the drawing room and pressed her face into the gray silk, and Eleanor put her bare hand on the small dark head and held it there, ring and all, and did not let go. They were married in the autumn, quietly, in the small church on the Wexford land, with the child for a witness and the portrait taken down from the wall and rehung in its proper place at last. There was no crowd and no breakfast for 50. and no notice sent to the papers to be admired by strangers. There was the vicar, and the cold, clean smell of the old stone, and Beatrice in a new white dress strewing the path with the last roses of the year, and Eleanor in a gown of soft green that was the first new thing she had owned since Dorset. When the moment came to give the ring, the Earl did not produce a new one. He took her bare left hand and folded her own fingers, closed over the band she already wore, the thin gold she had once hidden under kid leather, and he said the words over it, and that was the whole of the ceremony, and it was a great deal. The dowager did not come to the wedding. She came instead, 3 weeks after it, in her own carriage and her own time, and she sat with Eleanor in the morning room and said, after a long silence and with great difficulty, that she had been wrong about a great many things, and that she found she was too old to enjoy being right at the cost of her grandson's happiness. She had watched the boy turn his sister's portrait to the wall, she said, and had told herself his coldness was strength, because the alternative was to admit she had let him grieve alone for 2 years, and called it dignity. She had not expected, she said, to be taught otherwise by a widow in borrowed grey. It was not an apology. Quite. It was as near to one as a woman of her making could come, and Eleanor, who had been schooled in mercy by her own long season of needing it, took the old woman's hand and let it be enough. The dowager came to dinner after that, on Thursdays, and was gentler with the child than anyone had thought she had it in her to be, and if she never said the word, she had come close to saying she did not need to. The household had already heard her. The first snow of winter came early that year. It came in the night and laid itself white and clean across the Wexford grounds, and in the morning Eleanor stood at the tall library window with the fire high behind her and watched it fall. The portrait of the dead sister hung above the mantel where it belonged. The child slept late in the warm house, and on the third finger of Eleanor's left hand, bare now no longer hidden, the thin gold ring caught the cold, clean light of the snow, the way it had caught the candlelight on the first evening, when she had folded her hands and thought no one in all the glittering room would ever trouble to look. Someone had looked. He had noticed before the evening ended, and he had spent the rest of it, and every evening after, making certain she knew that she had been seen. The Earl came into the library while she stood there, and he did not announce himself, and he stopped behind her and looked at the snow over her shoulder, and after a while he said, in the level voice that no longer sounded to her like anything but tenderness, "Come away from the cold glass." She came. She had learned to hear what was inside the words. She turned from the window into the warm room and the waiting fire and the life that had, against every verdict the season had passed on her, finally and quietly become her own. Thank you for staying with Eleanor until the end. If her story moved you, I hope it stays with you a while after the snow.